The stove clicked and wheezed in protest as the tin door creaked open, revealing its dim orange glow. The women shuffled in closer, their fingers outstretched, steam rising from soaked sleeves and reddened skin. A scent of fish brine clung to everything: metal hooks, rope coils, oilskins hanging on pegs. But here, near the stove, it blended with something gentler: burned sugar from someone's forgotten thermos, and the faint sweetness of pine from the firewood. The joke, "They'll marry a fisherman," still hung in the air, echoing off the rafters in awkward silence. Some smiled. One woman, Marta, blinked slowly at the iron stove, her lashes crusted with frozen sea mist. In Bremen, she'd been a baker's apprentice. Her fingers remembered rolling dough, not salt-slicked nets. Beside her, Ilse pulled her damp scarf tighter, scanning the harbor through the open shed door. The dock was alive with motion. Fishermen hoisting baskets, gulls crying overhead, an old Labrador wagging its tail between boots. None of it matched the visions they'd whispered on the train: dog kennels, chain-linked fences, armed guards with American cigarettes and blank stares. Here, a young man in flannel had poured coffee for the guards and for them. One of the guards, Corporal Rosen, had even taken off his gloves to hand them out himself. He hadn't smiled, but he hadn't looked away either. Inside the shed, the fishermen didn't leer, didn't gawk. They returned to work, tossing glances that were curious, not cruel. The women leaned into the warmth, silent, as their breath mingled in the cold light. The stove crackled, and a kettle atop it began to rattle gently. Someone had placed it there without a word. No orders, no permission, just a gesture. Marta watched the handle tremble, her thoughts moving too quickly to catch. Of home? Of salt water on her tongue? Of the way the harbor wind here tasted different than the Elba's? Then she laughed, softly, nervously once, and the others followed. Brittle at first, then growing. For a moment, it felt like a break in the spell. The harbor worker who'd made the joke tapped his cap and walked out, his boots loud on the planks. A seagull swooped low over the doorway, and someone whispered, "We must be dead." Another replied, "Then the Americans heat hell with stoves." Ilse reached forward and placed her hand on the kettle lid. She flinched at the heat, real, solid, stinging, and smiled. The silence that followed wasn't fear this time. It was something else, something still forming. The stove hissed, a gull cried again, and the dock outside kept moving as if none of it had ever happened. The train sat idle beneath a thin veil of mist, its black cars absorbing the dull grey of early morning as if swallowing it whole. Inside, the air was already thick with sweat and rust. The women packed shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches that gave under every shift of weight. They had boarded at Fort Lawton, with nothing but the cryptic phrase ringing in their ears, "You're going north." No rank insignia, no orders, no destination marked on the manifest. Just guards with clipped expressions and bags packed hastily in the dark. Rumors buzzed beneath the engine's low moan. Alaska, forced labor, maybe worse. One girl whispered that women sent north sometimes never returned, that it was an exile, a place where punishment needed no walls. Some laughed to hide the panic, others turned silent, counting the rhythmic clacks of the tracks like prayer beads. Ilse clutched her coat tighter, not against cold but against uncertainty, and Marta watched the frost form tiny ferns on the inside of the windows. Outside, trees blurred past in endless parade, indifferent to the anxiety twisting in every stomach. Hours turned to days. Rations came late and cold. The guards didn't speak much, only barked instructions when the train stopped at lonely snow-covered sidings. At one station, an old man in overalls tossed apples into their car when no one was looking. The women stared, stunned. Not a word had been exchanged. They sliced the fruit with mess kit knives and passed it around in silence, the tart juice stinging cracked lips. A few wrote in notebooks, entries in pencil with small, sharp lettering, as if reducing fear to manageable syllables. Ilse scribbled, "We are not told where. We are not told why. The men with guns don't know either. They only know north." Someone joked it was a joke, that they were being taken to Santa's workshop to peel fish with elves. No one laughed. The farther they went, the less they understood. The forests grew denser, the stops rarer, and finally, the last name on the map someone had smuggled in, Spokane, slipped behind them like the edge of the known world. Then, nothing. No towns, no signs, only wilderness and the steady drum of the engine, like a heart too stubborn to stop. They slept in shifts, using each other for warmth, the guards growing more relaxed as miles fell away. But the women didn't relax. The not knowing hollowed them out more than any camp wall could have. They expected punishment, cold, perhaps violence. They did not expect kindness. And none among them, hardened or hopeful, could yet imagine a harbor where fishermen would offer coffee and gloves to the enemy. That future, even if real, was still frozen beneath the horizon. They were not what the war stories had taught Americans to expect. These were not steely-eyed guards or cruel interrogators. They were secretaries, kitchen hands, radio switchboard operators, women in wool skirts and sensible shoes, pulled from every corner of a crumbling Reich. Most had entered the auxiliary corps not with fanaticism, but with resignation, coercion, or the faintest flicker of hope for security in a collapsing country. Ilse had joined to escape the ruin of Hamburg, her apartment leveled and her family scattered. Marta, who once apprenticed in a bakery, signed the papers after ration cuts made civilian jobs vanish. Others were daughters of postmen, farmers, bookbinders. None had fired a weapon. Many didn't even carry real ranks. Still, the war reclassified them. Captured in the West, or rounded up in surrender zones, they were processed and labeled enemy personnel, assigned POW numbers as if their paperwork erased their personhood. The youngest, Greta, was just 17 and had lied about her age to follow her older sister into clerical service. She cried quietly at night on the train, her fingers locked around a brooch she said had belonged to her mother. The older women took turns comforting her, wordlessly. Most of them had been born between wars and had lived just long enough to believe in the promise of order before watching it collapse into ruin. Indoctrination varied. Some still clung to the party's slogans, quietly, carefully, but more did not. They were tired. They were unsure. Some were ashamed and wouldn't admit it aloud. But even shame had its layers. Shame for what they'd believed, and also for where that belief had landed them, shivering in borrowed coats, crossing continents as prisoners to a place none could find on a map. There were no ideologues among them now, just women with frost-bitten fingers and questions no one would answer. They spoke in whispers, not declarations. They braided each other's hair in silence, shared thread to mend seams, passed soap like currency. Whatever training they had, how to file reports, operate telephones, scrub barracks floors, it had not prepared them for this. Yet there was resilience. It hummed in the way Marta split her bread without asking, or how Annalisa sewed a tear in a guard's coat when no one told her to. Stripped of titles and uniforms, they found other roles among themselves. Caretaker, organizer, listener. Their strength, such as it was, lay not in ideology or orders, but in what they carried in silence. Memories of streets before they were rubble. Brothers who hadn't come home. or songs their mothers had sung when they were small enough to believe the world was safe. Now, cast far from all of it, they did not know that their captors would soon hand them mittens instead of rifles. They did not yet suspect that the enemy would see them not as soldiers, but as women who needed a stove. Alaska wasn't chosen for kindness. It was chosen because it was remote, underpopulated, and desperately short on labor. By late 1944, the American war machine had thinned every fishing town of its working-age men, pulling them into the Pacific front or stationing them on cold decks of destroyers. The canneries still operated, but only just. Seasonal hauls of halibut, salmon, and cod risked rotting on docks for want of hands to process them. Civilian recruitment had failed. So, behind closed doors and clipped telegrams, a logistical compromise was made. The War Department, under increasing pressure from regional industry, authorized an experimental prisoner transfer from Fort Lawton to isolated Alaskan harbors. Women, German, not considered combatants, not high risk. Minimal escape threat, one memo noted dryly, due to surrounding geography and climate. The tone was bureaucratic, antiseptic. The real meaning was clear. They'll freeze before they flee. The transfer was small, only a few dozen, and organized quietly to avoid scrutiny from the public or military press. The Geneva Conventions permitted POW labor so long as it wasn't for military ends. Fish processing qualified. Still, eyebrows raised. Using women and Germans in civilian-facing industries? But desperation dulled objections. The harbors needed hands, not ideology. A folder circulated through command chains, typed pages, rubber-stamped, no photos. The women became line items. Helferinnen, age range 17 to 34, healthy, unarmed, functionally literate, amenable to labor. Some didn't even have full files, just camp numbers and scribbled notes. Logistics dictated the rest. One escort unit per dozen prisoners, minimal armament, cold weather gear issued from surplus. They would work, they would eat, and they would be monitored. Officially, no one expected problems. Unofficially, no one cared what happened as long as fish left the docks in barrels. No comfort was planned for them, no integration, no mercy, and certainly no expectation that these women, trained in filing cabinets and typing pools, would end up swapping recipes with fishermen or laughing by a stove built for strangers. No one imagined they'd become a curiosity or even a welcome presence. That possibility wasn't considered in any memo. It wasn't accounted for in any line item. The plan, from a desk in Washington, was simple. Put the women in the cold, let them work, and keep them quiet. What happened next? What grew between dock and stove, between glove and gesture, was never part of the order. It was a consequence no one foresaw, and it began, simply, with a transfer. Not a gift, not a welcome, just a line on a chart. Deployment approved, Cordova, Alaska, civilian labor support, non-combatant POWs, effective immediately. The boat cut through the inlet with a low hum, its metal hull parting the grey water like a blade through oil. Salt clung to every surface, rails, ropes, eyelashes, and the women stood in silence at the bow, bracing against the wind that rose from the Gulf. For days they had seen nothing but sea and sky, but now a thin line took shape through the fog. Not the prison camp they had imagined, but something that looked almost like a painting. Cordova revealed itself slowly, as if reluctant. First a cluster of warehouses, then the angled roof of a cannery, its smoke already curling into the morning air. A narrow dock extended like a finger from shore, slick with frost. Beyond it, Pine-covered hills rose sharp and dark against the pale sky, and somewhere behind them, a church. Bells sounded once, high and lonely. The women strained to see barbed wire, towers, guard dogs. None appeared. Instead, they saw people, civilians, children. An old man with suspenders and a tobacco-stained beard. A woman with a scarf tied under her chin, standing beside stacked barrels. The town hadn't hidden for their arrival. It had come to watch, not as a mob, not hostile, just curious. The women stiffened, waiting for jeers or turned backs. Instead, the crowd stood quiet. Then, movement. A man in rubber overalls stepped forward, unspeaking. He looked no different from the others, except for one gesture. He removed a single fur-lined glove from his left hand and placed it gently on the dock's wooden rail. No ceremony, no words. Just a glove, fingers slightly curled, left like an offering. The women didn't understand. Was it meant to mock them? Was it pity? Then the guard beside them, Rosen, gave a small, surprised snort and muttered, "Well, I'll be." The boat groaned as it nudged the dock. Ropes flew. The gangway dropped. No one moved at first. Then Ilse stepped down. Carefully, deliberately. Her boots hit the wood with a hollow thud. She didn't look at the glove. She looked at the man. He didn't flinch. One by one, the others followed. Marta clutched her coat tight, eyes flicking from the church spire to the fish crates, to the steam rising from the cannery roof. The town smelled like brine and wood smoke, nothing like home, but also not foreign in the way fear is foreign. A child waved. One of the women waved back before she realized what she was doing. The guard said nothing. The fisherman said nothing. But in that silence, something passed between them. Something unfinished, but already underway. And the glove remained where it was, gathering frost, undisturbed. The biscuit was still warm when it hit her palm, wrapped in a linen napkin, dotted with what looked like bits of molasses, and offered without a word. Marta had stood frozen, her fingers slow to close around it. She was too stunned to speak, too stunned even to thank the woman who placed it there before disappearing back into a doorway near the cannery. That night, in her notebook, she wrote, "I thought we would be spat on. Instead, a woman handed me a biscuit. I cried into my scarf." The contradiction ran deep. Everything they had been told, trained for, warned of, none of it fit. Their uniforms, already worn thin, marked them as the enemy. But here, that label seemed to falter. The guard who escorted them to the dormitory wore no expression. The town itself was quiet, with none of the jeering or gawking they'd braced for. At meals, a local woman ladled fish stew into their bowls without speaking, but also without disdain. Her eyes lingered on each face, not unkindly. The bunks were hard, but the stove was lit. There were blankets. At the cannery, things grew stranger still. The tasks were grueling, hauling crates, trimming fins, brining meat with raw hands. But they were not punished for being slow. No one shouted. The American foreman, a man named Harold with a voice like sandpaper, pointed and demonstrated, then walked away. They mimicked him. Within 2 days, the line ran smoother. On the third, someone left a pair of wool socks folded on the edge of the workbench. No note, no ownership claimed. They assumed it was a mistake, until the same happened again. Ilse, who had trained under military code to inventory every item, every calorie, whispered, "Nothing is accounted for here. It just is." They had been taught to believe the enemy would treat them as animals. Instead, the enemy handed them gloves and biscuits and let them cry in peace. It was not warmth exactly. It was not friendship. But it was not cruelty. It was survival tempered by custom, a kind of frontier pragmatism that made no time for hatred. The war, for these Alaskans, was something distant. A shadow behind the glacier, loud on the radio, but quiet on the dock. The women, for their part, struggled to process the absence of violence. Even the silence was difficult to understand. Back home, silence meant punishment or obedience. Here, it meant privacy. It meant no one asked where you came from, or why your boots didn't match, or why your hands trembled over soup bowls. It was not what they expected. But then, nothing in Cordova was. Not the smell of cinnamon in the market, not the child who offered a drawing in crayon, not the guard who offered to sharpen their knives for fish work. They had prepared for insult. What they found instead was space. Not forgiveness, not yet, but space to exist without fear. And in war, that was its own kind of mercy. The cannery was a world unto itself, loud, wet, and steeped in the smell of brine and old iron. The floorboards slicked with fish oil gleamed like glass under bare bulbs, and steam hissed constantly from open pipes and bubbling vats. Work began early, long before the light hit the mountains, and ended only when the final crate was nailed shut. The German women, still unused to the rhythm of American labor, had no time to falter. Gloves were optional luxuries. Salt water bit through wool and skin with the same indifference. Gutting tables lined one side of the long hall, while the packing line ran opposite, its motion unceasing. On their first day, Marta slipped on a frozen puddle and landed in a bucket of salmon heads. She expected laughter, but the Aleut woman beside her simply helped her up, handed her a cloth, and returned to splitting open fish with quiet precision. Ilza worked next to a Filipino worker who showed her how to use her thumb to twist the gut line free in one clean motion. No words were needed, just a nod, a repeat, a smile. Within days they communicated through motion. A raised eyebrow meant pass the blade. A tilt of the chin meant crates full. A tap on the shoulder signaled shift change. One woman from Bremen, tall, stern-faced, with braids coiled tight, learned to gut a halibut in under 3 minutes by watching a retired Scandinavian fisherman who sang quietly as he worked. She kept pace with him by the third morning. No one told them they were fast. No one told them they were good. But no one stopped them either. That too was a kind of approval. The fish themselves came in massive hauls, halibut the size of door frames, silver salmon wriggling even as they hit the tables. Blood pooled in the slats and froze around their boots, but the women adjusted. They wrapped their legs in sacks. They tied twine around their wrists to keep sleeves tight. They learned how to tuck bandages under fingernails when the cold split skin. During breaks, they sat on upturned crates and shared food. Bread, pickles, dried fish, passing tin mugs back and forth, learning names in fragments. Anya, Luz, Eric, Greta. One man gave Marta a biscuit and gestured to the stove without comment. No one scolded him. No one stopped her from taking it. The guards stood back now, less watchful. There had been no incidents, only fish, only work, only women whose hands, once trained to type orders and file reports, now moved with the grace and speed of people who knew what it meant to survive through repetition. The war seemed to hang outside the cannery walls, muffled by the clatter of knives and the hum of the conveyor. And in that soundscape of labor, the women found something strange and unfamiliar. A rhythm not of command, but of coexistence. They didn't see prisoners. Not at first. Not even when the boat came in and the guards kept hands near their belts. To the fishermen of Cordova, hardened by tides and ice, the women who stepped off the transport looked more like school teachers than soldiers. They were bundled, exhausted, blinking too fast in the cold light. "They were just girls," one of them said years later in an interview, his voice creaking with age. "And cold. We had fish, so we shared." That was the arithmetic of the harbor. It wasn't about politics. It was about boots that fit, fingers that bled, and work that needed doing. Many of the locals were children of immigrants themselves, Norwegians, Swedes, Filipinos, Aleuts, families who had come with nothing and survived by helping one another, not by judging who deserved help. Ideology didn't scale a frozen dock. One old man, the same who left the fur glove on the railing, had grown up during the Russian flu and told his grandson, "The ocean doesn't care where you're from. If you fall in, it'll kill you just the same." That ethic ran through the town like brine in the planks. The Germans, whatever they had believed, whatever uniforms they'd once worn, were now just another pair of hands to gut fish, another set of lungs to steam up the windows at lunch. At first there was hesitation. Some of the older men had fought in the Great War, and their eyes narrowed with old memory. But the POW women did not sneer. They did not act proud. They worked, quietly, efficiently. And when one girl nearly sliced off her thumb on the third day, it was a local boy who rushed her a bandage and said nothing of it again. Word spread through the town that these prisoners weren't monsters. They were cold, tired. They drank coffee like anyone else. They missed home like anyone else. A few locals kept their distance, muttering about kraut girls, but most didn't care. Winter was coming, and the fish wouldn't clean themselves. When a storm tore a tarp off the west warehouse, 2 German women climbed the roof with the others to hold it down. No one had told them to. One fisherman offered his scarf to a blonde girl whose ears were burning red, and when she gave it back days later, it had been washed and folded. That was all it took. One scarf, one quiet thank you, one shared cigarette behind the shed, and whatever labels had followed these women off the train began to wear thin. No one forgot the war, but no one needed to be reminded that cold was cold, hunger was hunger, and sometimes mercy wore the shape of a hot stove or a fillet knife passed from one cracked hand to another. The canal froze faster than expected that week, sealing the inlet in a sheet of glass that shimmered blue beneath the morning sky. The ice machine had coughed its last the night before. Something about a corroded belt, or maybe just old age, and without it, the cannery couldn't send out shipments. Fish waited in barrels packed with nothing but seaweed, and time ticked loud in every warehouse. That morning the foreman cursed under his breath and said they'd have to wait for a repair crew from Valdez. But Ilse, hearing the news secondhand, simply shrugged and said, "Then we dig." By mid-morning, half the German women stood by the canal's edge, boots sinking into snowdrifts, sleeves rolled to the elbow. They didn't wait for permission. They asked for shovels, for axes, for anything that could chip and crack. A teenage boy brought them pickaxes from his uncle's shed. An old woman handed out mugs of broth with chunks of halibut floating inside. The Americans didn't know what to make of it. But then a fisherman stepped up beside Marta, rolled his shoulders and swung his axe into the ice with a thud that sent shivers down to the waterline. And just like that, a rhythm began. Swing, crack, shovel, toss. Boots shifting, shoulders rotating, arms warming with motion. The canal began to fracture in long, jagged veins. The sun climbed higher, catching the shards and throwing light against the women's faces until their cheeks flushed pink from wind and effort. Someone began humming, a low, nonsense tune with no words but a beat, and another joined, then another. Greta slipped and landed on her side. Everyone gasped. She sat up, laughing, snow clinging to her back, and the sound spread, cracked out across the ice like a fallen plate. one of the Aleutian. Boys clapped and someone else made a joke in broken German that none of the guards understood. The work continued all day. When the pickaxes dulled, they dipped them in the fire and went on. Blisters bloomed, but no one stopped. By sundown, the canal was broken open in 3 places, just wide enough for the barrels to be slid through and floated downstream. The foreman walked the edge slowly, saying nothing. Then he nodded. Once. The gesture was seen, and that was enough. That night in the bunkhouse, Marta wrote simply, "Today, we cracked the canal, the ice and the silence both." Outside, the wind picked up again, but inside, someone started singing a lullaby that wasn't German, and no one asked her to stop. It started with a knife, a quiet moment, and a sliver of cedar plank near the stove. The tide had gone out, leaving behind silence broken only by the occasional hiss of salt water steaming off boots, and Marta, restless with the ache in her arms, crouched beside the wall and began to carve. The words weren't planned. They simply rose, part mischief, part longing, part weary amusement. Ich will einen Fischer heiraten. The letters scratched in slow arcs, uneven but legible. It wasn't meant for anyone. But the next morning, Corporal Rosen passed by, mug in hand, and squinted at the carving. He didn't scold. He didn't bark. He chuckled, a real chest-deep sound, and muttered, "You'll have to stand in line then." Words spread like warmth from the stove itself. That day, 6 women passed by the plank with smirks curling at the corners of their mouths. By evening, someone had underlined the phrase with a strip of salmon skin nailed flat. "I want to marry a fisherman." It was a joke, of course. A shield against the cold, against memory, against the ache of not knowing what came next. But it was also something else. A way to say, we see them. A way to admit, we are seen. The fishermen noticed too. They didn't point or comment, but one began leaving extra biscuits on the workbench. Another sharpened knives with an extra pass, then handed them over without a word. The slogan slipped into speech, not shouted, but whispered, in German and in English, like a superstition. When a crate fell and cracked open, scattering cod across the dock, a girl muttered it with a sigh and a grin. When a boy from the village asked Greta if she wanted to help with net mending, she turned and said, "He's not a fisherman yet. I'll wait." Even the guards stopped pretending not to hear. One evening, Rosen leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching the women cluster near the stove. "So," he said dryly, "I assume I'm too army for your tastes?" The room filled with laughter, sharp, real, surprised. It was the sound of walls thinning, not disappearing, not yet, but thinning enough for breath to pass through, and the carving remained, darkened by smoke and time, a private rebellion etched into timber. It wasn't about marriage, not really. It was about choosing joy over fear, defiance over despair, humor over silence. In a place built for function, fish, crates, quotas, the women had found something useless and vital, a line of text that no one ordered, no one erased, and everyone understood. The paper was rough, the pencils short, but the lines filled up quickly. Every Sunday, under the supervision of a Red Cross liaison and a silent American sergeant, the German women were permitted to write home. 1 letter, 2 pages, no politics. What began as formulaic lines, "I am healthy, I am safe, the weather is cold," soon grew into coded sketches of their days, mentions of fish stews, gloves passed in silence, laughter over coffee tins. Marta wrote, "I have work that makes my back ache and people who do not spit when I walk past." Greta sent her mother a drawing of a gull perched on a crate marked Cordova. None of it directly stated kindness, but the tone softened, and that was enough for rumors to take root. Through the twisted channels of war, letters passed to the Red Cross, whispers in POW camps, second-hand stories carried by Swedish diplomats. Echoes of Cordova began to drift back across the Atlantic. In bombed-out towns in Bavaria, in crowded homes in Saxony, mothers read letters that sounded nothing like war. "They are feeding them fish," one neighbor said. "Someone said they live in dormitories, not cages." Others dismissed it. Propaganda, lies to ease their shame. But the stories persisted. A camp in western France reported a woman weeping, not from punishment, but because a child had handed her a flower. A soldier's wife told her sister, "They say one of the girls fell in love with a fisherman from Alaska. Imagine." No names were given, no confirmations followed, but even the idea of it, a German prisoner, not broken but baking bread beside a stove, was enough to disrupt the narrative. Inside the Cordova camp, the women felt the shift. Replies trickled back weeks later, blurred by redactions and censorship, but full of confused relief. "We thought you'd be punished. We thought they'd humiliate you. Are you really safe?" Marta, reading one such reply in the fading light of the stove room, folded it slowly and whispered, "They don't believe it." Ilse nodded. "Neither did we." By then, the carving on the wall had faded from joke to quiet anthem. "Ich will einen Fischer heiraten" had been copied into letters, scratched onto soap boxes, murmured under breath as the cold crept through the shutters at night. It meant more than it meant. It meant we survived. It meant we were not hated. And perhaps, for a few of them, it even meant we were wanted. In a war that had taught them to expect nothing but punishment, the ability to send home news of decency became a quiet defiance. And thousands of miles away, in homes darkened by blackout curtains and ration lines, the rumors continued to ripple, soft, improbable, persistent as tide. The orders came quietly, folded in a courier's leather pouch, and delivered to the guard post just after dawn. No sirens, no warnings, just a few lines typed on pale government paper. Transfer effective, February 12th. POW exchange protocols activated. Female labor detachment to be relocated inland. The words landed with the cold finality of falling snow. The women were told over breakfast, as they cradled their tin mugs and watched steam curl into the rafters. No explanation, no debate, just a new schedule. Greta stared into her stew and whispered, "So that's it?" No one answered. The town heard soon after. Word traveled faster than paper in Cordova, and by midday, fishermen stood in clumps on the dock, arms crossed, faces unreadable. They didn't shout, they didn't plead, but they didn't smile either. One brought a crate of dried cod and left it by the dormitory steps. Another dropped off a pair of freshly mended boots with a note that said only, "For Ilse." No one made speeches. No one protested aloud. But in the hours before departure, the harbor moved slower, as if trying to draw out the minutes. The women packed in silence, folding scarves and pencils and the few keepsakes they'd been given. Marta slid a tin carving knife into her coat pocket, a gift from the alute man who had taught her to fill it faster than she ever typed. At the stove room they paused. The plank was still there, smoke darkened and streaked with fingerprints. "Ich will einen Fischer heiraten." No one dared touch it. As the sun slipped low and the boat readied to leave, the guards lined the women up along the dock. No chains, no shouting, just a final head count. From the corner of her eye, Ilse saw something shift near the mooring post. A fisherman stepping forward, removing his worn brown hat, and placing it atop the wooden rail with a slow, deliberate motion. He said nothing. Then he stepped back. The women looked on, unsure whether to smile or cry. The gesture said what no one dared. "We saw you. You were more than numbers here." As the boat pulled away, steam curling behind it, the town grew smaller, the warehouses receding into fog. The hat remained on the dock, motionless in the wind, a quiet symbol of something neither side had words for. No parade, no banner. Just that, an empty hat and a space now left behind. He found the letter beneath a pile of fishing permits, its envelope thin and creased from the long journey overseas. The name was misspelled slightly. Mr. Halvard Eriksson, Cordova Harbor. But the postmark was real. Bremen, June 1950. He read it slowly, sounding out the uneven English, each line shaped by a hand that had once gutted halibut beside his in the cold light of an Alaskan winter. "I am married now," it began, "but I will always remember the stove and the smell of fish, and that you gave us mittens." Halvard sat on the edge of the dock, boots swinging above the tide, and let the words settle like salt in his beard. The letter wasn't long. It spoke of a small apartment in Bremen, of a husband who had never seen Cordova, of a child named Marta after her grandmother. But mostly, it spoke of memory. "You did not speak much," the letter said, "but your eyes were not cruel. That saved me, I think. That, and the way you gave me an extra biscuit when I fell. That was more than food. That was permission to still be human." He folded the page gently, like something living, and tucked it into his breast pocket. Around him, the dock looked unchanged. The same gulls cried, the same wind carried the same seaweed sting. But something had shifted in the space between that winter and this summer, between girl and woman, war and peace. She hadn't signed the letter with her last name, just Annalisa, and that was enough. He hadn't known if any of them remembered. He hadn't known if it had mattered, but it had. Not in a loud way, not in history books or parades, but in the quiet rhythm of work, of decency exchanged like currency on cold docks and near warm stoves. The war hadn't ended that day in Cordova, but something in it had softened, its edges dulled, its stories complicated by kindness. And now, 5 years later, a letter crossed an ocean to say, "I remember." The mitten, the stove, the unspoken mercy. That too was history. That too was part of what survived.